joined us. Please switch on your uh, camera. I'll just give a introduction to you. I'm sure all of you know Dr. Abha Majumdar. She is the director and head of Center of IVF and Human Reproduction, Gangaram Hospital, and lots of accolades under her name. She's had the President's Medal for the best medical graduate, and these accolades start right from her initial career onwards. Um, so President's Medal early on, she has received the BC Roy Award, which is probably one of the highest awards for teachers. In 1999, Vikas Ratna Award, Chikitsa Ratna Award, also felicitated by the Agra Medical College for outstanding contribution to the field of infertility. Appointed by the National Board of Examinations as the course director. Um, Again, loads of publications by ma'am and her team at Gangaram. And I'm sure all of you have heard her speak, and we're really looking forward to a very interesting lecture by ma'am today. She's going to be talking on following up of ART pregnancies. And ma'am, all yours. Looking forward to a fantastic lecture.
Thank you, Keshav, for the kind introduction. So lovely to see you grow in such a beautiful way. And I'm going to talk on a very non-interesting topic for a lot of people, but I think I want you all to understand that this is a very, very important topic, and we just don't have to look at pregnancy rates and um, head and heels all together to just make a patient pregnant. We have to look at a much larger picture of the ART outcome, and I'm going to talk on follow-up of ART pregnancies and their outcomes. Now, what am I going to look at? I'm going to go exactly in a clockwise manner as the squares you see here. We'll see what effect does ovarian stimulation and fresh transfer have on the perinatal outcome. What effect does frozen embryo transfer have? If in a cycle ICSI has been done, what effect would be there? If there is severe male factor for which IVF ICSI has been done, any additional problems to be looked into? Then when we do extended culture, blastocyst culture has become a very normal method of making embryos and transferring to get the highest possible pregnancy rates. But are there any problems associated with that? And also with the culture media? Then I look at embryo biopsy, which is again now in commonplace for all the PGT procedures, whether it's A or structural or gene. And the use of donor oocytes, surrogacy, and not to talk about multiple pregnancy specific complications. So I'm going to deal with all these 9, and you will follow the square on top of the pages. No point will take more than 3 to 4 pages, so you should be able to understand the topic better. So we first go to, and what is the perinatal outcome which is affected by ART procedures? There are only 5 things which happen in babies. One is the birth weight could be affected, which means they could be small for dates, they could be normal for dates, or they could be large for dates. The gestational age could be affected. That is, they could be preterm, peri-preterm, post-term. Congenital malformations, we are interested whether any ART procedures causes congenital malformations. Epigenetic phenotypes, I'll talk about this. And any childhood cancers which are associated with the ART procedures we do. So these 5 things we're going to look at into the perinatal outcomes, apart from a
Can
little
I
bit of
interrupt?
antenatal. Yeah.
Ma'am, they're requesting to raise the volume a little bit. So
Oh
if you
my
can.
goodness, I have used a microphone and this is a constant problem. Should I speak louder? Is it
Yes.
audible now? After Jaideep, my voice always goes less on the
I think
audience
that's
here.
much better. Thank you, ma'am.
Okay, thank you very much for sort of interrupting, because this is one constant problem which happens with either my computer or maybe me itself. So these are the 5 points we see as perinatal outcomes: birth weight, gestational age, congenital malformations, epigenetic phenotypes, and childhood cancers. Now we go back to the procedures I told you, and the first one is, you see on the top, ovarian stimulation and fresh transfer. A lot of us do this, and I want to tell you the effect of controlled ovarian stimulation with fresh embryo transfer on gestational age and birth weight. So these are the 2 things which are affected. And I took all this data from a Catalan cohort study based on 14,262 newborns. These were all Barcelona data where they've got a registry for all births, and so they could take out data from 2008 to 2012. This was published in Fertility Sterility 2017. What did they say? Higher risk of preterm birth, higher risk of very preterm birth, which is less than 32 weeks, increase in small for gestational age, that means less than 2,500 grams, increase in very small for gestational age, which means less than 1,500 grams, and along with that, associated perinatal morbidity and mortality. So this is what they found, that if we did a fresh ET, all this happened to the birth, to the baby in higher frequency. What is the reason for this? What did they think was doing this? Why fresh ET in a controlled ovarian stimulation cycle may affect birth weight and gestational age? Well, the same study says that the hormonal dysregulation in the endometrium during the implantation window has been evaluated as a factor that could interfere with the implantation process. In natural cycles, spontaneous conception, we don't have any stimulation. We don't have any high physiological, we don't have any high hormonal levels. They are all physiological. And therefore, there is a whole lot of difference between the COH cycles followed by embryo transfer and the natural cycles where spontaneous pregnancies happen. And it has been postulated that altered endometrial receptivity and or placental dysfunction as a result of high estrogen levels at the moment of implantation is responsible for defective placentation and the low birth weight of these babies or preterm labor also. Now, it is very important. I've given all the references. If you want, you can just click a picture and go through all the references, and you'll find beautiful articles describing this. Then there is another very important thing, levels of serum pregnancy associated plasma protein A, PAP-A, which is also known as glycodelin factor. It is an indirect marker of placental function, and it is lower in IVF pregnancies with controlled ovarian hyperstimulation than in spontaneous conceptions. So this is another factor which probably leads to defective placentation. Now let's move to frozen embryo transfer. Now this is the method of embryo transfer today. If you make 5, 6 good embryos, then you would definitely keep most of the embryos for frozen transfer apart from the one which you've done as first transfer. So what happens with frozen embryo transfer? We are going to look at 3 important effects which have been postulated to happen with frozen embryo transfer. One is high birth weight, childhood cancers, and epigenetic phenotypes which may happen in these children. This is a study from, just let me read it. Yes. This is perinatal outcomes of children born after frozen thawed embryo transfer. This is a Nordic cohort study. This is from all the Scandinavian countries, which includes Denmark, Sweden, Norway, along with that Finland and Iceland. So what did they do? They got all the data, perinatal outcomes of children born after frozen thawed embryo transfer. This is a Nordic cohort study from Konart's group, and it was published in Human Reproduction in 2013. This is data of all singletons born after FET, which is a large number for them, 6,647. And this was all mostly slow freezing, because till 2007, slow freezing was still the main method of freezing embryos. Compared to control of singletons after fresh IVF ET, the number was 42,242. And singletons after spontaneous conception. Now, what did they find? If you find here in the chart, which you see, the red column shows FET and the blue column shows fresh IVF. Preterm birth, in fresh IVF, it's much higher. Low birth weight, fresh IVF is much higher. Small for gestational age, fresh IVF. But as soon as we go to large for gestational age, the FET group shows higher numbers. Babies larger than 400-500 grams, again, FET group is larger. So what did they conclude? Embryo freezing does not adversely affect perinatal outcomes in terms of preterm birth and small for gestational age compared with fresh IVF ICSI. The confirmation of an increased rate of large for gestational age after cryopreservation, as well as the happening of macrosomia related perinatal mortality, warrants further research. Now, we are happy we don't have small for gestational age and preterm birth, but we're not also very happy with macrosomia. So a lot of investigation went in by the big bodies of the world. And this is the HFEA figures which I brought here. And this is 112,432 singleton pregnancies which were uh, evaluated. It was published in 2016, and this data extends, it was taken from 1991 to 2011, which is 20 years data. What did they find? Risk of low birth weight is lower in frozen ET. So this was a good point, that we found that frozen ET doesn't have so much of low birth weight. Risk of high birth weight was higher in frozen embryo transfer. Risk of very high birth weight again was higher with frozen embryo transfer. Congenital anomalies, no difference in the risk of any congenital anomaly after frozen or fresh ET. So this was a very, very big satisfaction. And then we come to another study. Again, this is large baby syndrome in singleton born after frozen embryo transfer. Is it due to maternal factors or the cryo technique? Now, two things happen. In fresh transfer, there is hyperstimulation of the cycle, and in frozen transfer, there is a added cryo technique. Is the cryo technique something which is doing all this to our pregnancies? Now, if you see these two forest plot, you'll see the diamond is towards favor of the frozen embryo transfer. The large dead babies are all towards frozen embryo transfer, nothing is towards fresh. So what was concluded? Frozen embryo transfer singletons have increased risk of being born large for gestational age, which is not explainable by maternal factors or birth order. We could say multipara, no, it's not the reason. Maternal factors, no. And then adverse outcomes such as stillbirth, asphyxia, shoulder dystocia, hypoglycemia, respiratory distress, and perinatal mortality are increased in macrosomic babies. In all macrosomic babies, these problems would happen. That is why we don't like too much of macrosomia also. Then higher risk of large for gestational age in FET singletons should raise a concern and effort made to outline the causal pathways between freezing and thawing of embryos and the growth potentials. And the knowledge on epigenetics and in particular metabolomics of FET is very limited. Neither do we know the genetic programming. This should be addressed in future animal studies. But then I'll bring you to a very, very interesting study. And this was perinatal outcomes in children born after fresh or frozen embryo transfer, a Catalan cohort study based on 14,262 newborns. And this was done in Spain. And you know what did they do? They did a very interesting thing. They said, okay, we'll do a fresh embryo transfer, but we will not do it in COH cycle. So that COH effect is gone. Then we'll know whether it is the freezing thing which is doing all this, or the no freezing embryos. For that, they took a model of a donor uh, egg program. What did they do? The recipients were either prepared simultaneously, synergistically with the donor, and there was a fresh embryo transfer done in the recipient. The recipients were either in the natural cycle or HRT cycle, and then a frozen transfer was also done in the same way, that is natural cycle or HRT cycle. So whether a fresh embryo transfer was done or a frozen was done, the recipient was not hyperstimulated. So what did they see? This theory allowed to isolate the possible detrimental effect of vitrification and devitrification on embryo from the hormonal effect of COH on the endometrium, thus on perinatal outcomes separately. And what did they find? Previously reported differences in birth weight, gestational age at delivery, and other perinatal outcomes after fresh ET and FET are more likely to be related to the detrimental effects of hyperstimulation on the endometrium during COH rather than the effect of the vitrification process. So thank God, at least this study brought in a big sigh of a big sort of relief to all the fertility people, because otherwise vitrification would have been a process which we would have needed to review again. Now, having told that, I'm just showing you a few bar diagrams. Don't get confused. We look at the first one. And if you see here, the P value is very significant when we look at fresh ET and frozen ET, very low birth and low birth weight babies. And same way, the cesarean rate and normal delivery rate is, the cesarean rate is much higher in frozen embryo transfer because babies are large, whereas natural conceptions and natural deliveries are common in autologous eggs because deliveries are small in fresh ETs vis-a-vis frozen. So I'm just leaving this for you. Conclusion of this study was It is the first study to explore perinatal outcomes in women from an egg donation program where recipients underwent fresh or frozen ET in either HRT or natural cycle with no effect of COH. Results suggest that supraphysiological hormonal levels of COH play a major role in the birth weight of children born in fresh versus frozen ET rather than the process of vitrification and devitrification. An improvement in perinatal outcomes after using frozen embryos may also be because freezing and thawing maybe promotes embryo selection. It filters out the weak embryos and allows only stronger embryos to survive, implant, and lead to live births. Having said that, I would say further studies are still required to assess estradiol levels during the stimulation process on the day of the transfer, which are required to support these findings. Now we go to the second thing I was talking about frozen embryos, that is cancer risk with frozen thawed embryos. And just look at the numbers, and this is because they have national registry. Every ART procedure has to be registered, every birth has to be registered. So this is a retrospective cohort study based on Danish population based registry data and the Danish infertility cohort. That includes 10,85,172 children born in Denmark between January 1st, 1996 and December 2012. Now, there were a total of 2,217 children diagnosed with cancers. Now, and this follow up is till 2015. So, all the births which happened till 2012 were followed till 2015, and the cancers which were found there were identified. This is the gist of the whole study. It looks like a very busy slide, but I will draw your attention towards just few important things, which is childhood cancer was 17.5 per 100,000 for children born to fertile women and 44.4 per 100,000 children born after the use of frozen embryo transfer. So we can see the stark difference in the two. And among children born in Denmark, the use of frozen embryo transfer compared with children born to fertile women was associated with a small but statistically significant increased risk of childhood cancer. This is frightening. This association was not found for the use of other types of fertility treatment examined. So it was only with frozen. And which were the cancers which were seen to happen more? Oh, what's happened to my slide? Why is it not moving? Okay. Leukemia was one, and sympathetic nervous system tumors were the other. So these two cancers were thought that they had increased in the group which had FET. Having said that, we have to look at caution. The numbers are great. 100,000 may say 17% and 100,000 may say 44% per 100,000 is a small number yet important. Then epigenetic imprinting disorders. Here I would ask everyone to take a sigh of relief because these are the human phenotypes identified and associated with imprinted genes. Beckwith, Weidman syndrome, Angelman syndrome, Prader-Willi, Silver-Russell, transient neonatal diabetes mellitus, McCune-Albright, familial non-chromaffin paraganglioma, maternal and paternal unipaternal disomy, and a Turner's type also. But the relative risk for an imprinted phenotype is increased in the ART population. This is understood. But the actual risk for one of these phenotypes to occur in an assisted pregnancy, that is assisted reproductive pregnancy, is estimated to be low at less than 1 in 5,000. The exact biological etiology for this imprinting risk increases the likely heterogeneous and requires more research. So we say the risk is so low that we really don't need to think about epigenetic imprinting disorders, especially with frozen embryo transfer. We need to only look at large babies and how can we reduce the incidence of very large babies. And number two, maybe a slightly increased statistically significant risk of childhood cancers, especially leukemia and the sympathetic ganglion tumors. Now we come to the next point, that is ICSI, which is now so prevalent that almost 80% of cycles do have ICSI in them.
Ma'am, 1 second. I'm so sorry.
Yeah.
I think the slides are not moving. Can you share your screen again?
Okay, but my slides were moving.
No, but it wasn't visible. So no
My
worries,
slides
ma'am.
are not moving. All right. Now, this is again a large population-based cohort study from Denmark, and so impressed to see what these Scandinavian countries do. They have such large national data registries, and that is how they can take out such large population-based cohort studies. Now, what did they do? They saw neonatal outcomes of 446 children born following surgical sperm retrieval procedures such as testicular sperm extraction, testicular sperm aspiration, percutaneous epididymal sperm aspiration. And with what did they compare it? They compared it with ICSI with control groups that included children born following ICSI with ejaculated sperm. The number was 8,967, with simple IVF 17,592, and spontaneous conception, which was 63,854 during the same period, 95 to 2009. And this was published in Journal of Human Reproductive Sciences 2019, but then this really came up in the controlled national cohort study of human reproduction 2013, from where I picked up all this data. Now, for singleton births, they found no significant difference in the risk of preterm birth following ICSI. Similarly, there was no significant difference in the risk of low birth weight following ICSI, but there was a small thing which I want to draw your attention to. Testicular or epididymal sperm versus ICSI with ejaculated sperm, odds ratio 1.3, no difference. ICSI with testicular epididymal sperm versus conventional IVF, odds ratio 1.9, still less than 2. ICSI with testicular or epididymal sperm versus natural conception, odds ratio 1.02. So there's no difference. And similarly, when we look at low birth weight, testicular or epididymal sperm versus ICSI with ejaculated sperms, odds ratio 1. ICSI with testicular or epididymal sperm versus conventional IVF, odds ratio 1.2. But then the risk of low birth weight was higher following ICSI with testicular or epididymal sperm versus natural conception, because the odds ratio came below 1, which was 0.5. So we saw that low birth weight increased with ICSI, but when we only compared it to natural conception. But when we compared it to conventional IVF or ICSI with ejaculated sperm, it had no difference. Now we move on to severe male factor, and this is from the Canadian OBS and Gynae guidelines, clinical practice guidelines for ART, pregnancy outcomes. And this was replaced uh, in 2014 from their guideline of 2006. So what did they say? This is just a guideline which says all men with severe oligospermia or azoospermia, which means less than 5 million per high power field sperms, should be offered genetic and clinical counseling, karyotype assessment for chromosomal abnormalities, and Y chromosome microdeletion testing prior to IVF ICSI. So there are only two things you need to do for all low sperm count. And this is important counseling. It is genetic counseling as well as clinical counseling. One is the Y chromosome microdeletion, and two is chromosomal analysis, the karyotype, which we call. Then all men with unexplained obstructive azoospermia should be offered genetic clinical counseling and genetic testing for cystic fibrosis prior to IVF with intracytoplasmic sperm injection. Now we come to the embryology part, extended culture and culture media. When I say extended culture, it means singleton pregnancies from transfer of blastocyst in IVF appear to have a higher risk of preterm and very preterm delivery when compared with cleavage stage embryo transfer, even though individual studies have been conflicting. And I'm giving you a reference here, which is important. You will get a lot of studies on this topic there. It is a systematic review and meta-analysis which was published in Fertility Sterility 2013. Then culture media IVF with cook media resulted in smaller babies versus vitrolife culture. Differences in weight were significant even after 2 years of life. G5 medium versus human tubal fluid showed significant differences in gene expression of over 900 genes between the studied media. Results favored G5 medium. Now, these are the two references, 2 and 3. For these two also. And those who are interested can take up this slide and read the details about the media, which can cause differences in smaller babies and larger babies, and the blastocyst transfer, which has controversial studies. Then we come to the next procedure of embryo biopsy, trophoectoderm biopsy. This is maternal and neonatal outcomes associated with trophectoderm biopsy. And this study comes from Hanover Medical School, Stanford University School, and Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine. So this is an important study which was published in Fertile Sterile in 2019. And this is special in one way, that the results of this study lend more applicability than previous studies to current clinical settings by only investigating trophectoderm biopsy for PGT. They did not look at the effect of PGT, which has on children, or the effect of PGTA or the PGT structural rearrangement. That was not looked. It was only the biopsy related complications which were seen, and the utilization of PGT has been increasing. We all understand it reduces risk of aneuploid pregnancy loss and aneuploid pregnancy also. It may shorten time to live birth for couples who are undergoing problems with genetics or translocations, and it enables couples with single gene disorders to have an unaffected child. But what increases is very, very important: threefold statistically significant increase in odds of preeclampsia with trophectoderm biopsy. So this is the most important thing, that if you've put in a PGD embryo, please look out for preeclampsia, give something to prevent it, because there is a threefold increased risk of preeclampsia in these women who have a biopsied embryo inside them. And there is no statistically significant differences in adverse neonatal outcome. Nothing else is different. But preeclampsia in the mother is a real problem. And despite the advantages, it is important to consider potential risk. With increasing use of PGT, we need further investigation into potential risk. So we have to understand this. Now comes the most important section of donor oocytes, and I've devoted 4 slides to this section because I feel it is very important once we're using donor oocytes to know what maternal and neonatal complications could happen and be prepared beforehand to face them. So oocyte donation, uh, IVF with a donated oocyte is an independent risk factor for hypertensive disorders in pregnancy, such as preeclampsia, severe preeclampsia, and then low birth weight, which is related to all the 3 disorders. An alteration in placental markers is seen in these pregnancies, which is associated with a higher risk of anomalous placentation and placental insufficiency. So, donor oocyte, all this happens more. But what are the reasons? It could be hormonal or it could be immunological aspects. So, let us look at both of these in one slide each. Hormonal. Most FET protocols use HRT, and Jaideep was explaining this, that HRT cycles, the problems are more, and I'll tell you that what happens to neonates and with the problems. Most FET cycles protocols use HRT, which is a very convenient protocol. And what does this HRT do? It suppresses the HPO axis and there is no corpus luteum which is formed. Although estradiol and progesterone are replaced in the first trimester, we give them till the placental function takes over fully. Other products of the corpus luteum are not given, like relaxin hormone, whose role is very, very important for maternal cardiovascular adaptation to pregnancy. Now, if frozen embryo transfer occurs in a natural cycle, then there is a corpus luteum sitting over there. Our current RCT showed FETs in a natural cycle, there is no increase in risk of preeclampsia. This is 2018 study. And HRT, FET cycles have higher rates of preeclampsia, 12% versus 3%, with a p-value which is significant. Severe preeclampsia, 9.6% versus 0.8%, again a significant p-value compared with modified natural FET cycle. So even if it's a natural FET cycle or a modified natural, having a single corpus luteum is good enough to protect these women from the aftermath of preeclampsia. So please, when you're using a donor oocyte, start thinking about natural cycles or spontaneous ovulatory cycle if the patient still has her periods. And then one was hormonal. The other theory given forward was abnormal maternal immune response. Now, why is it so that, the donor egg cycles have more preeclampsia? Is there some immune pathology involved in it apart from the corpus luteum? Well, preeclampsia could result from abnormal maternal immune response to the new fetal antigen derived from paternity. Higher risk of PET in IVF oocyte donated pregnancies could be due to higher degree of antigenic dissimilarity compared to spontaneous pregnancies. Spontaneous pregnancies would only have half parent sort of foreign antigens. Here, the whole antigens are foreign, the maternal as well as paternal. So there's much higher degree of antigenic dissimilarity in these. Then there's a high rate of complications in oocyte donor pregnancies. It could be consequence of a high level of HLA incompatibility. A lower prevalence of preeclampsia has been found in IVF donor pregnancies when the donor was related to the recipient like a sister than when not. So it may be worth to do a HLA study of the donor and recipient in order to select haplo-identical combinations that would be more comparable to spontaneously conceived pregnancies. I mean, we could make these oocyte-donated pregnancies more similar to spontaneous pregnancies if the antigenic dissimilarity becomes less. So these are the two theories given forward. One is the corpus luteum and other is the HLA differences. So how do we prevent OD related complications? First thing, we must know. We must have knowledge that oocyte donation may lead to problems. So we must have preconception knowledge of risk during pregnancy, regardless of age of the woman or multiple pregnancies. That will bring up further risk in these donor oocyte pregnancies, especially if the maternal age is high. We're not talking about high 70, 80, but I'm talking of 40, 45 also as high. Most IVF oocyte donation recipients are first-time mothers over 40 years and have pre-existing risk factors. And we have to understand that this patient will not go back to her third level town. There is a requirement for adequate monitoring strategies during prenatal period, labor, and postnatal period. I would say antenatal, labor, and postnatal care. What are the risks? IVF OD with oocyte donors carries 3 times risk of PET in comparison to spontaneous pregnancies. So what they've recommended when you use a oocyte donation pregnancy, 60 to 150 milligrams a day of aspirin in the first trimester to high risk women lowers risk by 10%. And we must have facility towards serial ultrasound to diagnose small for gestational age as well as fetal growth restrictions. Markers like uterine artery pulsatility index is important, and maybe we can combine it after the NT-NB scan with the dual marker, which is done at 12 weeks. How can we prevent it? One is, please do a single embryo transfer if you are using a donated oocyte, because in any case, a multiple pregnancy will have a higher risk of preeclamptic toxemia, and even a single pregnancy with donor egg has a higher risk of preeclampsia. Oocyte cryopreservation has also been suggested as an alternative to avoid donor oocytes later, and a lot of girls are coming forward to it who are delaying their pregnancy because of whatever reasons it is. They come and preserve their own oocyte so that they can use them, and then this oocyte will be their own, it will not be foreign to them. And future measurement of tyrosine kinase 1 uh, with placental growth factor ratio. Once we start calculating this, it may improve the management of preeclamptic toxemia. Having said that, I come to the last but very important part is surrogacy. Again, 2-3 slides devoted to this. Again, I take the help of HFEA data, which is 1 lakh, this is 10 lakh 3,160 singleton live births. Look at the numbers they have. 244 by surrogacy. I wish we had our numbers, we would have surpassed this. 87,571 self fresh IVF ICSI and 15,345 after self frozen embryo transfer were analyzed. So they did fresh, frozen, and surrogates. Now, does gestational surrogacy influence perinatal outcome versus pregnancy after autologous IVF? We are looking at the mother carrying her pregnancy herself vis-a-vis a surrogate carrying the pregnancy. Results from studies have not shown an increased risk of preterm birth and low birth weight after surrogacy, but hypothetically, immunological response to allogenic antigen in gestational surrogacy should be like the response seen in donor oocyte pregnancies. causing higher risk of hypertensive disorders and adverse perinatal outcomes compared to autologous IVF. So HFEA data was not looking very impressive. Possible differences in the underlying characteristics between oocyte donor recipients versus surrogate is likely to be the reason, as surrogates are generally younger and fertile and oocyte donor recipients are older. So this is what the HFEA said, that maybe this is the reason that we don't find any difference. But then someone came forward and they did one large study. This is the largest study and the only study to date published in 2017, where they looked at two pregnancies in a gestational surrogate. One was her own conceived pregnancy, and one was when she was acting as a surrogate. And they looked at all the statistics arising between these two pregnancies, antenatally and during labor, and then in the neonate. So neonates born by surrogates have increased adverse perinatal outcomes, including preterm birth, low birth weight, gestational diabetes, hypertension, and placenta previa compared to spontaneous live birth in the same woman. And this is what I have experienced in my practice, that a woman who had absolutely normal two children developed severe PET in her surrogacy pregnancy, and we had to terminate her pregnancy at 27 weeks to save her life. Etiology behind adverse outcome in ART conception is multifactorial. ART procedures may affect embryo quality and or placentation, and the negative impact cannot be overcome even with a healthy proven uterine environment. So whether it is ART or it is the foreignness of the whole embryo being to that woman, what is it? Immunological factors, or maybe the HRT cycle, which leads to all these problems. So this is the gist of that study, which was taken up, which was published in, which was discussed in ASRM December 2017. 124 surrogates, which had 494 pregnancy outcome, surrogate versus naturally conceived pregnancy, was significantly different. Pregnancy outcome was much better in a naturally conceived pregnancy by the same surrogate vis-a-vis her surrogacy pregnancy. Twin pregnancies were significantly higher, 33 versus 1. That is because two embryo transfer was a policy there also. However, miscarriage and ectopic rates were similar. Then out of 494 pregnancies, 352 singleton live births, 103 achieved from commissioned embryos, and 249 conceived spontaneously in the same woman. Now we look at the data of this. Surrogate pregnancies versus natural conception in the same woman. Lower mean gestational age, higher preterm birth, higher low birth weight. Surrogate C neonate birth weight on an average was 105 grams lower. But then FET might overcome this problem, maybe. Surrogate significantly higher obstetrical complications, including gestational diabetes, hypertension, use of amniocentesis, placenta previa, antibiotic requirement during labor, and cesareans. And this is a chart to show all these things. Can you still see my slides?
Yes, yes,
Yes,
ma'am.
okay. So you can see all the underlying things: hypertension, gestational diabetes, placenta previa, amniocentesis, all as p-value is more than 0.05, including antibiotics required in labor and total cesarean sections. So these are the perinatal outcomes after natural conception versus in vitro fertilization in a gestational surrogate. So this is all about that, and I cannot end without touching multiple pregnancy specific complications. We know there is plethora of complications with multiple pregnancy, starting from the first trimester to the postpartum period, and therefore the recommendation of the Canadian guidelines, OBS and Gynae, for ART um, assisted human reproduction pregnancy outcomes has been multiple pregnancy is the most powerful predictive factor for adverse maternal, obstetrical, and perinatal outcomes. Couples should be thoroughly counseled about the significant risk of multiple pregnancies associated with all assisted human reproductive treatments. The benefit and cumulative pregnancy rates of elective single embryo transfers support a policy of using this protocol in couples with good prognosis for success, and elective SET should be strongly encouraged. To reduce the incidence of multiple pregnancy, healthcare policies supporting public funding for ART with regulations promoting best practice regarding elective SET should be strongly encouraged. So with this last slide, I end my lecture saying that we do understand that, pregnancy rates are important, but we, at what cost we get. And normally my counseling to a patient is, when they say that I want a twin pregnancy, then I say out of 4 twins conceived, 3 have adverse outcomes. Either they are lost in the first or second trimester, or they are in the nursery for 1 or 2 months if you have a preterm birth. Only one child will go to term out of 4, where you will not need the help of nursery. So this is the amount of um, adversity which these patients have. But at that time, the happiness of getting pregnant, and that also twin pregnancy, is so much that they tend to overrule mentally all what has been explained to them. So we should be explaining to them more firmly. So ART on a whole is like a mobile phone. We cannot do without a mobile phone now. The science says cell phone radiation is dangerous for human health. It may be right, but we will still use it, because life is not possible without a mobile phone. Same way, life is not possible without ART. There are so many childless couples which have a child only after the help of reproductive technology, assisted reproductive technologies, and it has to continue to grow. We have to keep on researching to find out the best outcomes, the best methods. But so far, we have not found anything so adverse that we may have to stop a procedure or we may have to discard a procedure. Thank you very much.
Thank you, ma'am. Before you stop sharing, I'd request you to go to your epigenetics slide. I think that was one which was missed. And I think there were people requesting uh, to repeat that slide.
Yeah, okay. So, the best thing about this slide is that epigenetic imprinting disorders are so rare in IVF. It is 1 in 5,000. So, we do not really need to be scared. I'm not talking about SERs or other things. I'm talking about epigenetic imprinting disorders in normal IVF ICSI cycles. These are Beckwith-Wiedemann syndrome, Angelman, Prader-Willi, Silver-Russell, transient neonatal diabetes mellitus, McCune-Albright, familial non-chromaffin paraganglioma, maternal and paternal unipaternal disomy, and Turner's. All this is related to epigenetic imprinting disorders, but the actual risk for one of these phenotypes to occur in an assisted reproductive resulted pregnancy is estimated to be low, at less than 1 in 5,000. The exact biological etiology for this imprinting risk increase is likely heterogeneous and requires more research. So we can't just link it to frozen embryo transfer like we have been able to link the childhood cancers. So childhood cancer might have a very marginal increase, but we need more data. But we can't get data like this where there's such a big national registry that we can have such a huge data of so many children born. But then these are the two things which really raise concern. Epigenetic, I would not be concerned. Childhood cancers, yes, when you have a lot of benefits, then you use a mobile phone, even though you know that it's damaging my brain. So you still use it. And large babies, yes, have their complications, but in today's world where cesarean section is done so much easily with less complications, large babies may not have that type of effect as it used to have once upon a time when we were bent upon sort of delivering babies vaginally only.
Thank you so much, ma'am. There are some questions for you. So I'd request you to stop sharing your screen and I'll just moderate those questions.
Okay.
Awesome presentation. And it actually brings forward so many aspects about ART, which we don't even consider. And that was our sole motive of keeping this lecture, because apart from just tracking the clinical pregnancy rates, implantation rates, blastulation and live birth rates, there are so many other things that we need to consider. So my first question to you would be, what all do you monitor? Like you spoke about so many aspects today, what all do you really monitor in your own clinic, and how do you do it? Do you assign a person to actually follow up these pregnancies, or how to
I'll
actually
tell you,
manage?
Keshav, you must go through the data which Gaurav is following. I think he's doing a great job. It's not because he's related to me, but I truly feel that I could not have done that type of follow up which is being done. And you ask him for 2019 data, and you will see the type of follow up, though we are not following up the neonatal things so well. I wish we just now, after the presentation he gave last week on 2019 statistics of, first he presented fresh and then frozen, and we made a plan that we should link our neonatal data, the perinatal data with that, so that all the live births which have happened or all the pregnancies, the beta hcg positives, right starting from the first trimester, how many had bleed in the first trimester? I think 80% have bleeding in the first trimester. Now what really leads to that? Second trimester losses are very little, first trimester are more, but then after that, delivery, cesareans, weight, maturity, term of these babies, everything needs to be followed. I'm not even talking about cancers, epigenetic changes, not about anything, just the birth weight. This is what we thought, that we will link it with this data, and every year this will be our model to follow statistics in our lab, at least for whatever number of cases we have. So I wish, we could make a universal data registry in our own labs the same way, so that one day we can sort of collate everything and have a huge data bank with us.
So the first question to you is by Dr. Deshmukh, and she's asking what childhood cancers are common after FET. Are there any specific ones that we are thinking of? Or
I showed two. One was leukemia, and the other one was the ganglion tumors, the spinal cord ganglion tumors. But you see, when you see it into these cancers, they are few numbers per 100,000 live births.
yeah,
So it's a very, very small number. If you take out a percentage, then it will be 0.00017. You'll have to put three zeros in front of your one also.
yeah. So is it important for us to now put this in, because the number is so low? Should we put this in our consents, or should we let it be? Because that can also induce a lot of
Epigenetic changes and cancers, we don't put in our consents. We do put congenital anomaly. We do put preterm birth, small for dates, all this.
preeclampsia.
Preeclampsia. No, preeclampsia, yes. In preeclampsia was highest in donor egg pregnancies. It featured in the biopsied embryos, and it was there in surrogacy when we compared in the same patient surrogate pregnancy vis-a-vis her autologous pregnancy. So in all these three groups, we had higher preeclampsia. So I think preeclampsia is very important to monitor, and maybe in the first trimester test, we can include the preeclampsia screening also, and start aspirin for this three group of patients in the first trimester, which we normally don't give.
Okay. There's another question for you, and this is regarding luteal phase support. So, what's your preferred luteal phase support post transfer?
See, depends. If it is a hormonally derived cycle where I've given estrogen to make the endometrium, I would give a vaginal progesterone. My dose is 400 milligram of one of the micronized progesterones morning and night for as long as, if it's a blastocyst transfer, 11 days, and then we do a beta hcg. If it is a natural cycle, then also we give progesterone, but we always hear this, that you don't need to give progesterone. I heard Jaideep's lecture where also a study said that you don't need progesterone, but we still give 200 milligram morning, evening. The sad part is 200 milligram is not available very easily these days, and hence all the chemists tend to still give them the 400 milligram tablets, because they don't keep too many 200 milligrams morning, evening tablets.
The next one's about PGT. So, Dr. Deshmukh is asking, do you do PGT in all cases of RIF?
Well, PGT, the most common indication for PGT is high maternal age for us. Then structural chromosomal anomalies and single gene disorders is important. In RIF, yes, but not in abortions where we've not been able to link it genetically. Not in RPL, but RIF, sometimes, yes, we do offer PGT, especially if the age is over 35.
Yeah. The next one is there any benefit of giving high dose calcium lactate in OD preeclampsia?
I don't know. I'm sorry. I don't have an answer for this. I've never used it. But I think preeclampsia, calcium is something which a lot of people give, magnesium, calcium. So maybe.
Yeah.
I have no idea.
The next one was about HLA compatibility. You spoke a little bit about HLA compatibility between donor and recipient. they're wanting you to elaborate whether it should be really done and how to proceed with it.
We have to tell about this to our ART guideline makers, because they normally say that the donors have to be anonymous, whether it is a sperm donor or a oocyte donor. Sperm donor, we understand, because I mean, he's always antigenically different from the mother, but oocyte donor. And this is what the studies say. And I was quite surprised to read this, that these pregnancies have so much of preeclampsia, because maybe it is hormones that we've given a HRT cycle and not a natural cycle. But the other thing is that if it is a natural cycle and preeclampsia is still happening, then there could be a HLA dissimilarity between the donor and the recipient.
Ma'am, what about carrier screening? What are your views on carrier screening for donors?
I don't know. We do only thalassemia screening because that is the highest in this belt of ours. And on request of the parents, if they have something in mind, they have a genetic disorder, what screening would you do? You tell me. We look at blood group and we look at their thalassemia screen, because we don't want that if the girl is thalassemic, and we have to do it for the male partner also, because we don't want a thal major baby to be born to this recipient who's taking a donor egg. So apart from this, we don't do anything, but I would want to know what you all do. On request, we have done other single gene disorder screening, some chromosomal disorders which people have brought forward, but not on routine.
Is the same because nowadays there are companies which are selling these carrier screening
Yeah.
panels.
Hmm.
So just wanted to take your views on whether to really use them for donors or just to stick with sickle cell, thalassemia, etc. All of those things.
I don't even do sickle cell thalassemia. I just do thalassemia.
Thalassemia.
That's it.
Okay.
So one can always, you can upgrade your system by doing this type of screening for donors. But this is mainly for the banks to do. They should do all the screening and advertise their banks that we've done such a lot of screening. Our donors don't have any of these diseases. This is a matter of advertisement.
Yeah.
California, the sperm bank advertises only like this. The IQ, the screening, that is how they sort of
I was
advertise their
recently in a
donors.
panel with a Spanish company, and it's called Phenomatch, and they are now using artificial intelligence to match the facial features,
Oh,
and
wow.
then choosing the donors appropriately. So that's also happening now, and this is happening all over Europe now.
Yeah. So all over with donor eggs and donor sperms, there is so much of advertisement going on to match or to screen in a big way, that that is a selling point for them, and a lot of people opt for it.
Yeah.
There's no harm in doing it, and people are there who would opt for it.
What about karyotyping, ma'am? Would that be recommended?
Not routinely. We never recommend it routinely unless someone is finicky and says, I want a karyotype, especially if the woman has had a child of her own.
Yeah.
See, we normally take fertile donors, and when we take a fertile donor, then we know that she's had no miscarriage, she's had a child, her time to pregnancy was short, which generally goes a long way to say that she should not be having a karyotypic abnormality.
Okay. Last question, and this is about designer babies. What's your view on that, and what's your view on CRISPR?
Keshav, tell them about the conference you attended for the phenotype matching. That would be a designer baby. And the CRISPR is a technique which is still in the research thing. You cut off some genes, maybe diabetes, hypertension, you identify which are the genes responsible, and you can just cut them off. It's like editing a film on the video. We cut the ends only, but the real editors can cut from between also. Exactly, this is how the part of that chromosome which harbors that gene is just cut off and removed by laser. This is all I know about CRISPR. This is a technique of future. Maybe our next generation will see it. I don't think we will get to see it.
Okay. Last question for you, and I'll request all the participants to please switch on their cameras because we'll take a group picture. That's what we can resort to in these days now. So, ma'am, the last question is: how many times should a donor be undergoing an oocyte pickup?
A very difficult question to answer. The ART regulation has been changing right from 2004 till now, and but I truly feel that not too many times. If she has her own children, 3 times should be maximum, not more than that. But the ART regulation says only once. So let's see where the thing goes and stops. The pendulum is dangling between people use them for 6 times and 1 time, and I think 3 times is more than enough. I would want other panelists to opine on this,
Yeah.
but the pendulum will stop somewhere when the regulation will come up as a act.
Dr. Jaideep, can you also pitch in on this question till we have everyone switching on their cameras?
I think when we had the parliamentary board meeting for the ART bill, it wasn't really recent, it was in January. And because the proposed this thing was that once and only 7 oocytes, and that is what we were struggling. How can you just get 7 oocytes and not more? So we have actually said 3 times, but I think the bill still hasn't been passed in the Rajya Sabha. So we still need to know. But I personally feel 2 or 3 times should be okay. But how are you going to decide 2 or 3 times? Because all these donor agencies from one clinic to the other, to one state to the other, they are just rotating. And until we have registries for them, this
Yes,
cannot be plugged. So we need
we
to have our donor registries and surrogate.
a national data
Yes.
registry for all
And
donors.
that is what we have proposed in the bill.
There was another question about the bill, and that was about surrogacy. Are we still allowed to do commercial surrogacy because the bill
Huh?
is not passed?
Yes, as long as
Yeah,
it is
it
not
still
passed, we are all
increased.
doing it. Once
Mm.
it passes, we will have to stop, because then
Yeah.
we are going against the law. Right now, it's only guidelines. And like Jaideep said, 7 oocytes. How does it make any sense? Yes, we understand that if you have too many oocytes, you at least minimally, if you want to divide them between recipients, minimally 7 oocytes should be given, the lowest number. But I think 7 is not enough. We need to give them a little more if we are sort of taking them.
I agree.
Absolutely.
So, surrogacy, you can go ahead. There is absolutely right now no problem. And see, how do you define commercial surrogacy? Because if we have suggested the term compensatory. So, some kind of a compensation has to be given, whether it's altruistic or otherwise, because nobody will do it for free, or even if it is your relative also. So we have actually told them to use the word compensatory.
This is a damn good idea, I feel, because even if it is your daughter-in-law and daughter, and one is doing it for the other, there's so much pressure at home
Yeah,
that the daughter-in-law cannot say no. So that is also not altruistic. She's doing it
yeah,
under pressure.
yes.
So
All right. So I think that ends the course. I hope all of you really enjoyed. Let's give a big thumbs up and we'll click a small picture. Sumit and Vikas, whoever's there, uh, if you can take a screenshot of all the 3 pages. 3, 2, 1. And we'll do it one more time. Awesome. Thank you so much, everyone, for attending. And thank you to all the faculties who made our course really successful. And there was so much information that was shared over the last 3 days. It was absolutely mind blowing. Even though it was a basic course, there was so much to learn for everyone. And really, really thankful to all of you for sparing your time for this. I know these are very unprecedented times and so much is going on in the country. So requesting everyone to please be safe and just take care of your loved ones, and hopefully we'll get through this situation soon. So thank you so much and hope you have a great night ahead.
Thank
Bye,
thank
you.
you,
everyone.
thank
Thank you so
you,
much.
thank you,
Thank you, ma'am. Amazing presentation.
thank you. Yeah, you gave me a task to do. it was like पढ़ रहे हैं स्टूडेंट की तरह इतने आर्टिकल्स निकाले. I can't tell you, I have a whole now file of articles with
It was
30
really,
articles.
really, it was really nice, and
Of
that was
course.
absolutely up to date, and like really, really so much to learn from you. Thank you so much, ma'am.
Thank you so much, thank you,
Wonderful. Hi,
thank
Abha.
you. Hi, how are you? All of you safe so far?
So,
Huh?
so
Safe
far.
so far?
Yeah.
Okay.
So far, yes.
So far, yeah.
Chalo ji.
Chalo.
Take
Okay,
care,
Start.
guys. Bye bye.
love you all.
Bye.